Okay, GPU prices keep coming down as we get closer and closer to the next generation. Some people are thinking, okay, is this the time to buy the older generation? And depending on what price point you're looking at, you might be considering a 3070, a 3070 Ti, or maybe the AMD 6800, because it actually splits the price difference between those two NVIDIA models. Actually, this has been kind of a really interesting price and performance tier with these three models. Let me get myself out of the way here. And what do we got? So in the current market, the RTX 3070 is finally available at its $500 MSRP from a number of retailers. You don't have to find any sort of special deal. It's finally at its MSRP. Now, at this point in the product's lifespan, we would actually hope to see it well below its MSRP, and hopefully we'll get there soon, but that's where it is right now. However, if you wanted to buy the 3070 Ti model, the price is still up around $620 unless you get the Founders Edition on a Best Buy drop like I did, in which case you can get it for $600. Now that's a big price jump from the 3070 to the 3070 Ti, and AMD has slotted their RX 6800 in between those two price points. We see currently that you could get an RX 6800 for $550. I'd even seen them go as low as $530, counting a mail-in rebate, although currently that deal, I believe, is used up. And then, the prices do go up from here, but you can see that the 6800 is kind of between those pricing. However, if you look at a, relative performance chart like this one, at Tech Power Up, you'll see that the 6800 is listed as more powerful than even the 3070 Ti. Now that's based on rasterized performance, and it's also possibly a little bit out of date because their reviews would have been done probably without Smart Access Memory enabled, without a lot of driver updates that have helped out AMD over time. And in this video, we're going to look at where is the 6800 right now versus these two cards. Also keep in mind the models of the cards that I have. I have an RTX 3070 Asus Dual OC version because it was the cheapest model I could buy when I was buying. I got the RTX 3070 Ti as the Founders Edition model because it was the cheapest version I could find when buying. And my RX 6800 is the Asus, I found it here, guys. It's the PowerColor Red Dragon. So that's the version we've got there. So all of these I've got running at their out-of-the-box settings. I know some people dislike that, but I think that's the way you'll purchase them, and these were the cheapest models available when I purchased them, running at their out-of-the-box settings. Other than I do have resizable bar enabled for NVIDIA and Smart Access Memory enabled for AMD, and I've got an R9 5950X CPU system with 32 gigabytes of 3600 CL16 memory. Let's take a look at the head-to-heads. All right, we'll start out at 1440p resolution. I think most people buying cards of this class, 3070, 3070 Ti, RX 6800, are probably going to use it for 1440p, although I imagine there are probably some people considering 1080p or 1440p. Now, we can see a few things here. One thing is I'm intentionally using Cyberpunk 2077 at its Ultra settings, no ray tracing yet, although we will look at that, in order to simulate an especially demanding game. Many games are still not as demanding as Cyberpunk. Some people just accuse it as being extremely unoptimized. However you want to look at it, I wanted a game to stress test what, future games might be. Games get more demanding over time. So I wanted a demanding 1440p game so that when you buy your GPU, you can think about how it might perform over the next couple of years rather than just right now or in old games. And we can see here that the 3070 definitely dips below 60 FPS, and even the 3070 Ti does at times. Well, as the 6800 is delivering a much smoother, above 60 FPS experience, we can actually see about a 20% advantage for the 6800 over the 3070, and about a 10% advantage over the 3070 Ti. Now, it should be noted that even though here we're looking at an extremely demanding game, games can have their settings turned down. I know a lot of people like to play at the ultra settings, but a lot of times turning down to the high settings doesn't get you too much of a visual downgrade, but we do get a significant performance improvement. And so here we can see that all three GPUs really are very solid 1440p choices, even in extremely demanding titles. It's just on the weaker cards here, you might need to turn down some settings. And even on the 6800, check it out. You're getting a very high refresh rate experience here. Now, some of you might be looking at the cooler differences here. And remember that the 3070 Ti model that I have is the Founders Edition card, which has a fairly small 2-fan cooler compared to the cooler designs that we can get on some of the aftermarket coolers like I have on the other cards. So don't read too much into that temperature difference there unless you're thinking about the Founders Edition model here. But once again, we still see a healthy performance lead for the 6800 over both of the other choices. Now, some people are going to say that DLSS is so good that you're going to use it anytime it's available. So I thought it would be interesting to look at, since the 6800 had such a large performance lead, especially over the base model 3070, whether DLSS at the quality setting, so the best looking setting, would close the gap between it and the 6800. I was also curious how much of a performance lead the RTX 3070 Ti version would get by enabling DLSS at the quality setting. Now, you can mod FSR 2.0 into this game, so obviously you could compare the 6800 with that enabled. This game also has FSR 1.0 in its official implementation, although I will say FSR 1.0 certainly does not look as good as DLSS, and even the 2.0 version does have shortcomings compared to DLSS, so I know some people would be interested in the DLSS enabled versus native performance on the 6800. So here it is, and you can see on the average performances, the 3070 has a small lead, it's basically a tie, and the 3070 Ti does get a noticeable but not massive advantage here. But how about that ray tracing? We saw the 6800 is crushing, especially the base model 3070, without ray tracing enabled. Well, kicking on RT Low, which is the Ultra settings plus ray traced local shadows, and running at the native resolution without DLSS, I was actually surprised to see the 6800 a bit ahead of my base model 3070 here, and kind of matching the 3070 Ti version. Although I did notice at the beginning of the benchmark, the base model 3070 did seem to perform a little worse than expected, and I'm actually wondering if it's running over its 8 gigabytes of VRAM here. And the 3070 Ti does have a bit of faster VRAM, GDDR6X, so I don't know if I'm reading too much into that as far as its relation to VRAM, but I did think it was interesting. Now, I'll also mention that different ray tracing features perform differently on the different GPU architectures. So this is going to be the best look at the ray tracing performance for AMD in this title. You can see your averages here, and the 6800 actually kept up pretty well with the NVIDIA alternatives. But when you enable ray traced reflections, the NVIDIA hardware seems to handle it better, although you'll actually notice my base model 3070 seems to kind of crash and get the frame time spiking all over the place here at this portion of the benchmark again. And once again, I wonder if it's going past its 8 gigabyte of VRAM buffer, and you'll notice that its RAM usage actually goes up a little bit above my other two cards. Now, the 3070 Ti is also an 8 gigabyte card, although it does have that faster memory, and at about this point in the benchmark, the 3070 seems to catch back up and perform okay again. So I don't know what was going on with that. If I had more time and wasn't back teaching the school year again, I might, restart my PC, reinstall the drivers, see if there was something going on with that 3070. But either way, I would say that those options aside, the NVIDIA GPUs certainly do ray trace reflections better, and their upscale, I'm having to upscale all of them to reach playable performance here. The upscale with DLSS does look better than the FSR 1.0 upscale, and the 3070 Ti was certainly the best a ray tracing option there for ray traced reflections. Now here we're looking at their 4K performance, and I wanted to check this at the native resolution first before we look at any upscaling. Because I thought it would be interesting once again to see how AMD does here. We have the larger VRAM buffer and all of that, but this game is so demanding that I actually had to go down to the medium settings in order to get the 6800 up to around 60 FPS. The 3070 Ti doesn't really keep up all the way, but it does, do pretty well. But my 6800 is staying above 60 FPS much more of the time, and the base model 3070 is having some trouble here. Although, again, we could look at this with upscaling in a minute to see them kind of catch up. But it is looking here at the native performance. We know a lot of times that, Ampere, NVIDIA's architecture here does seem to close the gap with AMD the higher that you push the resolution. But the 3070 Ti certainly isn't catching up to the 6800 here. It is certainly still a little bit behind. Let's take a look at the averages here, with only the 6800 averaging over 60 FPS here, although it still did have some minimums below. So this is kind of interesting. What I looked at here was I targeted all of them at 4K high settings, and I tried to get them to be at around 60 FPS average using upscaling. But then I adjusted what type of upscaling was required to get there. On the base model 3070, I had to drop the DLSS to the balanced setting, which admittedly at 4K still looks pretty good. And on the 3070 Ti, I was able to just keep the DLSS at the quality setting, so it looks a little bit better than the balanced mode and still gets us around 60 FPS. Whereas the 6800, I'm able to use FSR 1.0 at the ultra quality setting. So while FSR 1.0 doesn't look as good at DLSS, I'm able to keep a much higher internal resolution, which actually helps the final image quality still look very good. FSR 1.0 Ultra quality at 4K does still look very sharp, and I think you'd have a pretty happy experience here. So I thought that was kind of interesting with the different upscaling techniques. Again, you can mod FSR 2.0 into this game. So that's obviously another thing that you could consider. Now, I figure before we leave Cyberpunk, we should take a look at 1080p, because I do know that some people would be purchasing these GPUs as high refresh rate 1080p GPUs, maybe with like a primarily esports focus in mind. But then you can also play some single-player titles and crank the visual settings. So, and especially if you're buying these GPUs now, you're at kind of the tail end of this GPU generation. So you might want to buy what would have been more of a 1440p card as a 1080p card now, so that it gives you more longevity in the future. The point is, we can see that even an extremely demanding game here, like Cyberpunk at 1080p Ultra, granted without the ray tracing turned on, all three of these GPUs are delivering excellent performance. So, I mean, we do see the 6800 ahead here, so there's no question about that it is delivering the better performance here. But we also see that the 8GB VRAM limit for the NVIDIA cards here doesn't seem to be causing any problems at 1080p. So there's our 1080p results. Now let's jump into some other games. Like, there's other games like Guardians of the Galaxy, which are a bit easier to run. Here's the 1440p Ultra settings. And I'll also admit that this game tends to be a bit NVIDIA favored, meaning cards that usually perform similarly will have the NVIDIA card outperform its AMD normal match, in other games. So this is a bit of an NVIDIA favored title, but even with that being said, the 6800 is at least keeping up and for the most part, usually surpassing the performance of the 3070 Ti and is still beating the 3070. You'll also notice that we run into some CPU limits a bit here. The frame rates are so high that even my 5950X does occasionally get a bit limited here. Now, if we look at the 4K Ultra setting, again, NVIDIA GPUs tend to scale better to the higher resolutions as long as VRAM doesn't become an issue. And this is a bit of an NVIDIA favored title, like I said, so I was curious if, with all of that in mind, the 3070 Ti would be able to close the gap on the 6800. And it's pretty close, but it does look like the 6800 is just a more powerful card and is able to still maintain a small lead over the 3070 Ti version, and is definitely having a healthy lead over the 3070 baseline version. But if we enable ray tracing, one thing that's nice to see here is actually that the 1440p ray traced high setting is performing well on the 6800. So you actually can get some, and in this game, the RT high setting is just ray traced reflections, and high is actually as low as they go. You can turn it up from there. The maximum ray tracing settings in this game also include ray traced transparencies and just higher resolution and detail and distance on the ray traced reflections. Here we can see the 6800 falling behind even the base model 3070. And being very much outclassed by the 3070 Ti, although once again, it is nice to see a title where an AMD GPU actually can give you decent ray tracing performance. Well, since we just looked at such an NVIDIA-favored title, why don't we go ahead and look at a more AMD-favored title, like Forza Horizon 5. Here we're looking at the 1440p extreme settings, and this is a title where the AMD GPU is able to access smart access memory and get some performance gains here, whereas the NVIDIA GPUs, this title just hasn't been whitelisted. NVIDIA, unlike AMD, has to whitelist in the drivers games to have resizable bar support, so they're not really gaining anything from that here, whereas the 6800 is. And so we're seeing a much larger than before performance gap. When you compare the performance gap here to what we saw in Cyberpunk, we're seeing that it's a much, much larger lead for the 6800. Now, jumping up to the 4K extreme settings, I was curious how the NVIDIA GPUs would do with their 8 gigabytes of VRAM here. It looks like they're really pushing right up against that 8 gigabyte barrier, but they're still performing fairly well. The 3070 does drop a little below 60 FPS at times, while the Ti model is much better able to keep over that. Now, notice the frame time spike that you see right here on the NVIDIA cards, but not the AMD card. I think that must have been VRAM related, because we saw it on both the NVIDIA cards and not the 16 gigabyte 6800. So it is possible that we are seeing a bit of the limit on that 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, but they were for the most part doing a good job, but they had that stutter count that the AMD card didn't. Let's look at 1440p max settings in Red Dead Redemption 2. And we can see here that once again, AMD is taking the lead, although it's not a massive lead over the 3070 Ti. It's definitely there. And when you compare it to the base model 3070, it is once again a much more noticeable lead. It doesn't seem like the 8 gigabytes of VRAM is causing us any particular trouble in this title or anything like that. And this is a fairly demanding section of the benchmark. So all of these cards seem to be able to max out 1440p Red Dead Redemption 2 without too much trouble. Sorry, the benchmark gets a little bit out of sync at times. That's just the way the benchmark is. It doesn't always play out the same every time. Now, going up to the 4K settings, they weren't able to perform super well with the maximum settings. But here I'm using the Hardware Unboxed optimized settings. They did a series of 2 videos when this game came out, and here we can see that the 6800, at its native 4K resolution with these optimized settings, is well over 60 FPS, whereas the 3070 is below. The 3070 Ti dips at times. So again, even though NVIDIA has that 4K advantage, closes the gap, we saw the 6800 was still definitely ahead there. Now, there's certainly easier games to run out there, like here's Horizon Zero Dawn, and we're again at the 1440p Ultra settings. And I'm not bothering showing the 1080p results here because I just run into a CPU limit because the frame rates get so high on these cards. But at the 1440p Ultra settings, again, the 6800 has a noticeable lead here. All the cards are doing extremely well, so this is a sign that, again, in the less demanding titles out there, like we saw in Cyberpunk, the base model 3070 dips below 60 FPS at times maxed out, but in older or easier to run games, all 3 of these GPUs can be crushing it at 1440p, and you can see the average results here if you want to compare percentages and all of that. Now, I believe I've actually mislabeled this when I'm doing my voiceover. I may or may not fix it in time in editing, but I have this labeled as 1440p Ultra, but this should actually be 4K Ultra. My apologies. Maybe I fixed it in editing and you're like, what is he going on about? Anyway, here we can see that at 4K Ultra, the 3070 is dipping below 60 FPS every now and then, whereas the 6800 is more comfortably over 60 FPS at the maxed out settings. Now, right here, we actually see all three GPUs with a small dip below 60 FPS, so there's certainly times where they would dip down a little bit. I should also mention that this game does support DLSS, so getting a little bit of a DLSS boost could help out our NVIDIA competitors. And speaking of DLSS and upscaling techniques, let's look at God of War here. First, we're looking at the 1440p native settings at the Ultra settings, but without upscaling. But this game will allow us to look at FSR 2.0 in just a second. But first, let's get the idea that these GPUs can all max the game out at 1440p, although you'll get a higher refresh rate experience on the 6800. And AMD used to trail in DirectX 11, but they've improved that in recent drivers. Here, though, we're looking at FSR 2.0 against DLSS, and we can see that FSR 2.0 looks very good. If you look at some of these small details in the distance, things in motion, I think you do get a little bit more image breakup in the FSR 2.0 image, but overall it does performance-wise keep up with DLSS and still look pretty good. Now, if we look at 4K at the Ultra settings, all three GPUs definitely dip well below 60 FPS, so I think using upscaling in this game would make a whole lot of sense at 4K. And that's where, again, yeah, these cards can be considered for 4K, but I think in many, many games, especially upcoming titles, you will want to be using upscaling. So here we're seeing DLSS quality and FSR 2.0 quality at 4K. I think they look very good at 4K, especially FSR 2.0 I think keeps up better at 4K image quality wise in my opinion. And we can see that here all of them except for the base model 3070 are able to maintain above 60 FPS with these settings. All right, so for some final thoughts here, one thing I noticed is that at least in my test suite of games and at various settings and whatnot, when we're looking at rasterized performance, I felt like my 6800 did better than this relative performance chart would suggest. Now, if you do a different set of 5 games or a different set of 10 games or a different set of 30 games or 50 games, you can choose a different selection of games that can skew these results one way or the other quite a bit. So that's one reason why I do these detailed head-to-head comparisons, is comparing two GPUs, there's a lot more to it than this little, relative performance number, right? There's a lot more to it than that. I think the biggest thing being the price. What are you getting for your money? What's your use case? We saw that while the AMD card does have the 16 gigabytes of memory, I didn't see a lot of places where I could conclusively say that made a huge difference. We saw a couple of stutters at 4K Extreme in Forza Horizon 5 on the 8 gigabyte cards. We may have seen a place where at 1440p with some ray tracing and Ultra at the native resolution, or even with DLSS a little bit, we may have seen a bit of a VRAM issue on the 3070, but for the most part, that wasn't a huge deal. Although having more VRAM going into the future is usually only a good thing, right? Over time, the VRAM usage can go up on games, but turning down settings and upscaling does also kind of rein in that VRAM there. Now, I will say that for rasterized performance, the 6800 was a hands-down winner there, even in very NVIDIA-favored titles. If we're not using ray tracing, AMD did still usually seem to come out ahead, even of the 3070 Ti. And I've got to say that the 3070 Ti just seems like a really bad value. It is a better card than the base model 3070, but it seems like this 6800 is getting you a lot more. And I will mention that if you go up to the 6800 XT, the prices on these seem to be coming down faster than the prices on the base model 6800. So if you start wanting to spend just a little bit more, instead of buying the 3070 Ti, I'd tell you to consider looking at the 6800 XT. because it's probably still cheaper than the 3070 Ti right now, and I've done a head-to-head comparison of these two GPUs, and the 6800 XT is a much better graphics card at most things than the 3070 Ti, but watch that head-to-head comparison video if you want that. So I've got to say, if it's between the 6800 for an extra $50 or the 3070, you know, I think you're getting a lot more performance with that 6800, but I've also got to question buying either of these at the current pricing, because the 3060 Ti is a bit cheaper than the 3070 and offers very close performance. Now, right now, I guess it actually looks kind of bad, so maybe never mind. But you can get it for $400 if you get its Founders Edition at least. And the 6700 from AMD, I guess the XT version, is a little weaker than a 3070, but is coming in at a lot less money. Whereas, again, with my problem with the 6800 non-XT right now is that I think its price needs to come down a lot further, because it is noticeably weaker than the 6800 XT, and yet the XT model at current pricing is just a small amount more. So honestly, my conclusion with this video is if I was thinking hard about the 6800, at current pricing, I'd probably grab the XT version. Hopefully the 6800 comes down a bit more. If I cared a lot about ray tracing features, I'd either wait for the next gen or probably go up to a 3080. And if I wanted to save money, like I said, okay, a 3070 is $500, a 6700 XT gets you most of the way on performance there, and I've seen them as low as $395. Looks like some of the cheaper models. Are GPU prices getting worse again? I hope not. Anyway, so that's my thoughts on that, is I'm not sure any of the GPUs in this video are actually the best deal right now. But pricing could change, and the head-to-head comparison could still be useful for you. So hope if you're seeing this video after prices have changed, or you're in a different market, you know, European markets, wherever, you know, your price to performance comparison could be a little bit different. I hope all of you have an excellent day.